I'm going to read from Luke, chapter 24, verses 13 to 31. Now on that same day, two of them were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem. Sorry, the computer's not working. About 7 miles from Jerusalem, and talking with each other about all these things that had happened. While they were talking and discussing, Jesus came near and went with them, but their eyes were kept from recognizing him. And he said to them, "What are you discussing while you're walking along?" And they stood still looking sad. Then one of them, whose name was Cleopas, answered him, "Are you the only stranger in Jerusalem who doesn't know the things that have been taking place here these days?" He asked them, "What things?" They replied, "The things about Jesus of Nazareth, who was a prophet, mighty in deed and word before God and all the people, and how our chief priests and leaders handed him over to be condemned to death and crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel. Yes, and besides all this, this is now the 3rd day since these things took place. Moreover, some women of our group astounded us. They were at the tomb early this morning, and when they didn't find his body there, they came back and told us that they had indeed seen a vision of angels, who said that he was alive. Some of them who were with us went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said, but they did not see him." Then he said to them, "Oh, how foolish you are, and how slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have declared. Was it not necessary that the Messiah should suffer these things and then enter into his glory?" Then, beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them the things about himself in all the scriptures. As they came near the village to which they were going, he walked ahead as if he was going on. But they urged him strongly, saying, "Stay with us, because it's almost evening and the day is now nearly over." So he went in to stay with them. When he was at the table with them, he took bread, blessed and broke it, and gave it to them. Then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he vanished from their sight.
Morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Right, this is episode 4, the final one in this series of sermons about the idea of a good apocalypse. So if you weren't here for the previous episodes, week 1 was about the idea that an apocalypse can be a good thing. It can be a moment where we break through rather than things breaking down. Week 2 was then about the I level, how this starts in our own minds and hearts. Last week was about the we level, about our kind of relationships with each other. And this week is about the world level, and especially the stories that we use to make sense of what is going on in moments of turbulence and crisis. One of my favourite quotes from one of my favourite writers, the American writer Jonathan Haidt, is that the human brain is not a logic processor, it's a story processor. As humans, we think in terms of stories. This is how we make sense of the world, who we are and our place in it, and so on. And I'm especially interested in the really deep, shared stories that we call myths. I love them so much I wrote a book about it called The Myth Gap, which came out about, 8 years ago or something. And the idea of the myth gap is that once upon a time, we were really rich in these very deep, shared stories about where we are, where we might be trying to get to, how to get there, and underneath it all, who we are. But in modern times, these deep shared stories called myths have fared less well. We've decided in our modern, rational way that things are either literally, scientifically true, or they're not true at all. And the kind of deep, poetic truths that myths have to tell us about, truths about the human condition have fared badly when held up to this scientific test. So these days, if you look up the word myth in a thesaurus, you find it in the same entry as words like bunk and fabrication and falsehood, which is a travesty because myths have deep truths to teach us. And when we think we can live without these deep shared stories called myths, we are in all sorts of danger. It's a bit like trying to navigate, and instead of the compass pointing north, it's just lazily drifting round and round. We're not sure without these kinds of stories what's important and what holds us together and where we're trying to get to. And so the idea of a myth gap is that when we lack these shared stories, the wrong kinds of stories can come in and start to fill that gap. One example of the wrong kind of story seeping in is the myth of the threatening, scary other who threatens to kind of overwhelm us and therefore we need to build walls to keep them out, the sort of myth that people like Donald Trump love telling us. Another example of the wrong kind of myth is the one that the marketing industry loves to sell us, the idea that you are what you buy, that at some deep level we're not good enough, but for the price of this product we will be made whole again. And then of course there's the myth that's especially relevant to moments of breakdown, the myth of collapse, like it's all unraveling, there's nothing we can do except to despair. Not a very hopeful or empowering myth. And the reason I'm talking about this is that in these moments of crisis, of shock, of turbulence, because we are creatures who make sense of the world through stories, in those moments we're all casting around looking for a story to make sense of what is going on and what's going to become of us. And I think we've lived through so many of these moments recently where something, there's a big shock like 9/11 or the fall of the Berlin Wall or the financial crisis in 2008 or COVID. Moments where it feels like everything's unsteady and we're not sure what we can rely on or assume anymore. And in those moments, it is so easy for the wrong kinds of story to take hold and then to become self-fulfilling prophecies. Because here's the thing about stories. They don't just describe the world around us and who we are. They kind of create the world around us and who we are. Because when we believe stories and start to act accordingly, we often make them come true. This is not an abstract point. If you think of what happens when you have a run on a bank, like happened with Northern Rock in 2008, that begins with a story. A story that there isn't enough money in the bank to meet everyone's withdrawals. And then when people start to believe the story, they start to behave accordingly, which is to say they start lining up outside the bank and saying, we want our money. And then suddenly what began as a story, as a rumour, has become reality. There really actually isn't enough money, and it's a panic situation. This is an example of how a story can become a self-fulfilling prophecy. The reason I'm mentioning all of this is that I think in this time of crisis and upheaval that we're in, we as Christians have a really rich set of stories to offer to help make sense of where we are and where we might be trying to get to and who we are. And there's three kinds of stories that I want to mention as especially useful, especially powerful in these moments. One of them is the story of Apocalypse, which is obviously what we've been talking about these last 4 weeks. And I think with apocalypse stories, these are really stories about something being revealed, an unveiling of where we are, why we've got to where we are, and of what's really important, what actually matters. The second set of stories that's really central to our faith, but also really helpful for making sense of a moment of shock and crisis, is stories about restoration, the theme that we were getting into when I did a set of sermons last year. So with restoration stories, the Bible is a restoration story. It begins with a tree of life at the center of the Garden of Eden. And then we lose access to that tree, and then, 66 books later, 750,000 words later, we get that same tree of life back here on earth and our access to it restored. It's a restoration story. And the whole idea of the everlasting covenant, which I was talking about here last year, is all about a covenant that holds things together. It can be broken, for example, through ignorance or injustice or idolatry. And when it gets broken, everything is at risk of unraveling. The Bible's full of imagery of kind of climate change, of droughts and floods and so on, as examples of this is what happens when the everlasting covenant gets broken. And so the whole idea of atonement, of self-sacrifice, is how you restore a broken covenant and bring everything back into balance. And that obviously is right at the heart of what Jesus is up to in the New Testament. And in our own times, it's so interesting how many stories that have become wildly popular are restoration stories too. You look at Aslan restoring things in The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe. You look at Gandalf and the Fellowship of the Ring helping to restore things in The Lord of the Rings. Star Wars, his Dark Materials, Harry Potter, these are all restoration stories. Things have gone out of kilter, often the seasons are out of balance, but through an act of self-sacrifice, things are brought back into balance and restored. So that's the second set of stories that come from our faith, which are now being used in all sorts of other stories to help make sense of where we are. But the third and final set of stories, the ones that I want to talk about this morning, are emergent stories. So if apocalypse stories are about where something is being revealed, and restoration stories are where something is being healed, emergent stories are stories where something is being born. Because what happens in all of those examples that I just gave of self-sacrifice is whether it's Jesus or Aslan or Gandalf or Obi-Wan Kenobi, they think they're going to die as a result of the self-sacrifice, and they do, but then they're reborn. And the thing that's fascinating to me, though, is that when Jesus comes back, as we just heard in this morning's reading, he doesn't come back exactly the same. His own disciples don't recognize him. He's come back and it's still Jesus, but he's somehow different. And that's also repeated in lots of the modern stories about this. So like when Gandalf comes back, he's Gandalf the White, not Gandalf the Grey. When Obi-Wan comes back, it's not in his corporeal body. They're kind of borrowing heavily from Christianity here. And I think there's deep wisdom there, this sense that that supreme self-sacrifice and then the rebirth, you come back the same but different. And modern psychology kind of echoes this. One of the ideas that trauma psychologists talk about a lot is the idea that when we recover from trauma, we don't just get fixed back to exactly how we were before. We come back changed, but sometimes having discovered kind of new depths to ourselves or new gifts that we have to bring to our community. Psychologists call this post-traumatic growth. The idea of a kind of wounded healer that Carl Jung used to write about a lot is another example of how when we come back kind of with wounds, it can also unlock new capacities in ourselves. And I think this is true as well at community level, not just at levels of individuals. But when communities encounter a moment of shock and crisis, there's that initial honeymoon period where everyone's pulling together and it can be quite exhilarating, like with the first lockdown. Hey, it's great, the whole community's pulling together. And then it gives way to a deep period of disillusionment, typically. And then beyond that, societies or communities enter a reconstruction phase, where often it's about finding a story of why did this happen and who are we as a community that we were able to rise to this and come through it. They don't come back exactly the same as how they were before. They may have discovered new depths in themselves. And there's one more emergence idea I want to mention before we finish. And that's the emergence idea of what if we are growing up as a species? I find this an incredibly helpful idea. There's a guy called Dwayne Elgin. He's an American writer whose work I really like. And he does a straw poll in his travels around the world, and we're going to try it right now. So I want you to imagine if humanity were like a single individual. What age would we be? Where would we be in our life? If you imagine humanity as a sole person, would humanity be a baby, a child, a teenager, an adult, or someone in their senior years? So we're going to do this poll before I tell you what Dwayne Elgin usually finds. So put your hand up if you think humanity is like a baby. Okay? Put your hand up if you think humanity is like a child. Okay, who votes that humanity is a teenager? Who thinks we're an adult? And does anyone think we're in our senior years? Okay, so what we've just proved there is what Dwayne Elgin always finds, that typically 2/3 to 3/4 of people instinctively see humanity as a teenager. And this is in all different cultures all over the world. I find this fascinating because as a father of teenagers myself, I know, and I remember from my own teen years, that of course when we're teenagers, it's a time when we're experimenting with things. We're very concerned with maximizing our liberty, our freedom of maneuver. We're often testing the limits a bit and seeing, can I do this? Well, what about this? What about this? And sometimes we can be a little bit heedless of the consequences of maximizing our freedom. But the thing is, it's all part of the process of growing up, of exploring who we are, of figuring out our kind of true identity. And we're on the threshold of something amazing, of kind of growing up into adulthood and taking on our full responsibilities and seeing who we can be. And maybe kind of really the beginning of wisdom. And in indigenous societies all over the world, these teenage years are understood as something really important, and they have a special set of rituals for that time of life. And of course, these are initiation rites. And in initiation rites in indigenous societies, there's always a test element. It can come with it, bring with it, absolutely the possibility of wounding. It can even carry the possibility of death. But on the other side of that test is something amazing and something beautiful. It's kind of being welcomed into the tribe or the community as a full adult. I find this a really hopeful way of thinking about the sort of sometimes apocalyptic feeling times that we're living through. That it's not a sort of time collapse of everything disintegrating. It's not a time of original sin, like, we got it wrong at the very beginning, we've been getting it wrong ever since, and we're always going to get it wrong. But the idea that we are the children of a loving creator, and we've been messing up loads in our teenage years, but we've also been figuring out who we are and learning an absolute ton. And now here we are at this extraordinary moment of the test, on the other side of which lies our species' adulthood. I find that a tremendously helpful myth for making sense of the times that we're living through. Anyway, that brings us to the end of the set of talks about the idea of a good apocalypse. I really believe that although these times are full of crisis and shocks and turbulence, and it's so important that we pull together as a larger us instead of fragmenting into a them and us, something that begins in our minds, carries through our relationships, and ultimately is kind of, nested in the deep stories that we use to make sense of the world. I definitely believe that this can be a good apocalypse, the kind that leads to breakthrough rather than breakdown. Anyway, that's it. Thank you so much again for having me.